The volcanic ash beneath their boots felt alien to the young Marines, who stepped onto Iwo Jima's shores in February 1945, each footfall sinking into the black sand as if the island itself sought to swallow them whole. Above them, Mount Suribachi loomed like a dark sentinel, its slopes honeycombed with fortifications that represented the culmination of Japanese defensive engineering. The island measured merely 8 square miles, yet within that compact space, Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi had orchestrated a defense that would challenge everything American forces thought they knew about modern warfare. For 9 months prior to the invasion, American naval artillery and Army Air Force's bombers had pounded Iwo Jima relentlessly, creating what military planners assumed would be a landscape of destruction where few defenders could survive. The confidence born from this sustained bombardment proved tragically misplaced. What intelligence officers failed to comprehend was that Kuribayashi had abandoned the traditional Japanese doctrine of defending at the water's edge, instead constructing an elaborate underground fortress that would absorb the punishment from above while keeping his forces intact and ready. 18 kilometers of tunnels snaked beneath the volcanic rock, connecting command centers buried 75 feet below ground, artillery positions that could appear and disappear behind steel doors, and machine gun nests so cleverly camouflaged that Marines would walk past them only to receive fire from behind. The Japanese commander understood that he could not win this battle through traditional means, but he could exact such a terrible price that the Americans would question whether any island was worth the cost. His defensive positions incorporated lessons learned from earlier Pacific battles, where Japanese forces had been decimated by superior American firepower in open combat. Instead, Kuribayashi's men would fight from positions where conventional weapons proved frustratingly ineffective. The reinforced concrete bunkers could withstand direct hits from naval shells. The tunnels allowed defenders to reoccupy positions that had been cleared hours before, and the interlocking fields of fire meant that advancing on one position exposed attackers to fire from 3 others. The terrain itself became an accomplice to the defense, as the steep terraces of volcanic ash provided no stable footing for advancing troops and prevented the digging of foxholes for cover. Equipment that seemed essential on the transport ships became burdensome weight that soldiers discarded within minutes of landing. Yet even unburdened, the Marines could only plod forward through the clinging ash while machine gun fire sought them from concealed positions. Among the defensive weapons were 320mm spigot mortars, explosive rockets, and conventional artillery pieces positioned where they could bring fire upon any point of the island. War correspondent Robert Sherrod, who had witnessed combat across the Pacific, searched for adequate words to describe the landing and settled upon a simple phrase that captured the horror: a nightmare in hell. As the first day's casualties mounted, and Marines realized that the preliminary bombardment had accomplished far less than hoped, a question hung unspoken in the sulphurous air. How does one defeat an enemy who fights from positions impervious to conventional attack, who emerges from tunnels to reoccupy bunkers already cleared, who has transformed an entire island into a fortress where every cave and concrete structure must be reduced individually? The answer would arrive not through overwhelming firepower alone, but through a weapon that could reach into the tunnels and bunkers where artillery shells could not follow, a weapon that brought psychological terror alongside its physical effects. That weapon was already being unloaded onto the beaches, 8 modified Sherman tanks that would change the calculus of the battle and provide American forces with the tool they desperately needed to break Kuribayashi's underground fortress. In the workshops and maintenance yards far from the front lines, a transformation was taking place that would alter the nature of Pacific warfare, though few beyond a classified circle of engineers and chemical warfare specialists understood its significance. The United States Navy construction battalions, universally known as Seabees for the phonetic pronunciation of their CB designation, had earned a reputation for solving seemingly impossible logistical and engineering challenges across the vast Pacific theater. These were men who built airfields on jungle islands, constructed harbors where none existed, and repaired battle-damaged equipment with whatever materials they could scavenge or improvise. Yet the project they undertook in the spring of 1944 at Schofield Barracks in Hawaii represented something entirely different from their usual construction missions. Colonel Unmacht of the United States Army Chemical Warfare Service had assembled a top-secret composite unit that brought together specialists from multiple services, his own 43rd Chemical Laboratory Company, Marines from the 5th Tank Battalion, and 25 Seabees from the 117th Construction Battalion. The Army had already created initial prototypes by mounting flamethrowers onto light tanks, designating them Satan tanks, but the designs reflected the Army's tendency toward complex engineering solutions. When the Seabees examined what the Army had produced, they brought the practical problem-solving approach that came from years of field improvisation under combat conditions. Their recommendation was characteristically direct: reduce the number of moving parts from over 100 to half a dozen, creating a system that could be maintained and repaired under battlefield conditions rather than requiring a specialized maintenance depot. The platform they chose for modification was the M4A3 Sherman tank, already proven in combat and available in sufficient numbers to support the island-hopping campaign. The Sherman's welded hull construction, powered by a Ford GAA V8 gasoline engine, provided a stable platform that could absorb the additional weight of flamethrower equipment while maintaining adequate mobility across difficult terrain. What emerged from the CB workshops was designated the M4A3R3, though it would become universally known by two nicknames that reflected both its function and its effect on those who witnessed it in action: the Ronson or Zippo tank, named after popular cigarette lighters of the era. The modification was brutally straightforward in concept, yet sophisticated in execution, replacing the tank's bow machine gun with a Mark I flamethrower that could project streams of napalm-thickened fuel across distances of up to 150 yards. Napalm itself represented a technological breakthrough that made vehicle-mounted flamethrowers practical for extended operations. Earlier flamethrowers had used raw gasoline or oil, which created impressive but brief bursts of flame that lacked persistence and often failed to ignite properly. Napalm, a gel created by mixing gasoline with a thickening agent, transformed the flamethrower from a specialized weapon of limited utility into a tool that could project sustained streams of burning gel that adhered to whatever it touched and continued burning with intense heat. The psychological effect of napalm exceeded even its considerable physical destructiveness, as defenders who witnessed its use understood that concrete and earth provided no protection once the burning gel found its way into a bunker or cave. By late 1944, the Seabees had produced 8 of these modified Shermans, specifically for the assault on Iwo Jima, and Marine Corps planners began incorporating them into the operational plans, with an understanding that they might prove decisive in reducing the fortified positions that honeycombed the island. Each tank carried enough napalm for multiple engagements, and the bow-mounted flamethrower could be aimed independently, while the turret's 75mm main gun provided conventional firepower against hardened targets. The armor that protected the Sherman's crew from small arms fire and shrapnel also shielded the flamethrower operator, addressing one of the critical vulnerabilities that had plagued infantry portable flamethrowers. Marine infantrymen who carried the backpack-mounted M2 flamethrowers had an average survival time measured in minutes once they began using their weapons, as the bright orange flames immediately drew concentrated fire from every enemy position within range. The CB-modified Shermans represented a solution that married protection with firepower, allowing the flamethrower to be brought to bear without sacrificing the crew members who operated it. As these 8 tanks were loaded aboard transport ships bound for Iwo Jima, few could have predicted just how crucial they would become to the battle's outcome, or how their presence would force Japanese defenders to choose between remaining in positions that could be reached by flame or emerging into the open, where they faced the full weight of American firepower. The stage was set for a new type of warfare, where psychological terror and physical destruction combined to crack open defenses that had proven impervious to conventional assault. The 8 Zippo tanks came ashore during the first day of the invasion, February 19, 1945, their tracked hulls churning through the volcanic ash that had already claimed vehicles and equipment along the congested beachhead. Despite their successful landing, Marine commanders initially held them in reserve, while conventional tanks and infantry attempted to advance using standard tactics against Kuribayashi's fortifications. The first day's fighting had already revealed the terrible effectiveness of the Japanese defensive positions, as Marines advancing across open ground encountered interlocking fields of fire from bunkers that seemed to regenerate even after being subjected to direct hits from tank guns and artillery. The frustration among frontline units grew as positions cleared with grenades and explosives were reoccupied through tunnels that connected the entire defensive network underground. On the second day of fighting, with casualties mounting and progress measured in yards rather than the miles that planners had optimistically projected, commanders made the decision to commit the flamethrower tanks to action. The first employment of these modified Shermans occurred against fortifications on the approaches to Mount Suribachi, where Japanese machine gun positions commanded the southern beach and prevented the consolidation of American forces inland. What happened next would fundamentally alter the tactical situation and provide Marine infantry with a tool that could accomplish what artillery bombardment and conventional tank fire could not. As the first Zippo tank maneuvered into position, its commander identified a reinforced concrete bunker from which machine gun fire had pinned down a Marine platoon for hours. The tank's main gun fired 2 rounds that struck the bunker's facade, but failed to penetrate the thick walls, demonstrating once again the inadequacy of conventional weapons against these fortifications. Then the bow-mounted flamethrower operator opened his weapon, and a transformation occurred that witnesses would struggle to adequately describe in after-action reports. A stream of burning napalm arced across the distance, its bright orange flame seeming to move in slow motion as it crossed the gap between tank and bunker, then splashed against the concrete and flowed through the firing slits like liquid fire seeking any opening. The effect was immediate and profound. Within seconds, smoke began pouring from the bunker's openings as the napalm found its way into the interior spaces and consumed the oxygen that defenders needed to breathe. Japanese soldiers emerged from a rear entrance, their choice reduced to facing the flames inside or exposing themselves to Marine rifle fire outside. Most chose the latter and were cut down as they fled the inferno. But the critical point was that the position had been neutralized in minutes rather than the hours that conventional methods required. Word of this success spread rapidly through Marine units engaged across the beachhead, and requests for flamethrower tank support began flooding communication channels from company and battalion commanders who saw in these modified Shermans a solution to the tactical problem that had bloodied their units. The psychological impact on Japanese defenders proved equally significant as the physical destruction the Zippo tanks inflicted. Soldiers who had been trained to hold their positions to the death, who had demonstrated extraordinary courage in the face of artillery bombardment and frontal assaults, found themselves confronting a weapon against which their concrete and earth fortifications provided no protection. The napalm could flow around corners, penetrate into connected tunnels, and continue burning long after the initial burst, creating conditions inside defensive positions that made continued occupation impossible. Some Japanese units attempted to respond by concentrating fire on the flamethrower tanks, recognizing them as priority targets that threatened their entire defensive scheme. Infantry support became crucial, as Marine riflemen provided security for the Zippos during their approach and engagement phases, preventing Japanese soldiers from attempting close-range assaults with magnetic mines or satchel charges. By the end of the first week of fighting, the Zippo tanks had become central to Marine Corps offensive operations on Iwo Jima. Units would delay their attacks until flamethrower tanks could be brought forward to support the assault, and the presence of these modified Shermans in an attack force provided a psychological boost to American troops who had witnessed their effectiveness. The tanks were consuming approximately 10,000 gallons of napalm each day, their operators methodically working through the network of fortifications that made each yard of advance so costly. Yet the battle was far from over, and the most difficult fighting still lay ahead in the northern sectors of the island, where the terrain and defensive positions would test whether the flamethrower tanks could maintain their effectiveness against an enemy who was learning to adapt to this new threat. The capture of Mount Suribachi on February 23, 1945, provided an iconic moment that photographers would immortalize and that would come to symbolize American determination in the Pacific War. Yet for the Marines fighting in the northern sectors of Iwo Jima, the flag raising represented merely the conclusion of the battle's easiest phase, a bitter truth that became apparent as they advanced toward the elevated terrain that dominated the island's interior. The fortifications protecting the Motoyama Plateau exceeded in sophistication and strength anything encountered during the fight for Suribachi, and the Japanese defenders under Kuribayashi's command were concentrated here in positions they had spent months preparing and provisioning. The area that Marines came to call the meat grinder incorporated 3 mutually supporting strongpoints. Hill 382, a rocky elevation that bristled with artillery and machine gun positions. Turkey Knob, an outcropping that provided observation over the entire American advance. And the amphitheater, a depression that channeled attacking forces into killing zones where Japanese gunners could engage them from multiple directions simultaneously. Every attempt to advance against these positions met with devastating fire that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, as the elaborate tunnel system allowed defenders to move between positions and concentrate forces at threatened points. Tanks that attempted to support the infantry found themselves targeted by carefully positioned anti-tank guns and subjected to mine strikes that immobilized them or detonated their ammunition stores. Into this nightmare environment came the Zippo tanks, their presence requested by every unit commander who understood that conventional methods of reducing these fortifications would consume weeks and thousands of casualties. The flamethrower tanks operated in coordination with infantry and conventional Shermans, creating combined arms teams that could suppress defensive positions with main gunfire, while the Zippos maneuvered into range for their primary mission. The process was methodical and dangerous, as each bunker and cave entrance had to be approached across open ground while under fire from supporting positions. Marine infantry would advance in bounds, using whatever cover the rocky terrain provided, while the tanks moved forward to positions where their weapons could reach the target. The napalm streams from the bow-mounted flamethrowers could reach 150 yards, but maximum effectiveness occurred at closer ranges, where the burning gel could be directed precisely into openings and where the psychological effect on defenders reached its peak. Japanese soldiers watching these weapons approach faced an impossible calculation: remain in positions that could be transformed into infernos within seconds, or emerge into the open where Marine riflemen and machine gunners waited with clear fields of fire. Many chose to fight from their positions until the flames arrived, their dedication to duty overcoming the basic human instinct to flee from fire. Others emerged with weapons blazing in desperate attempts to destroy the tanks before the flamethrowers could be brought to bear. But the combined firepower of the supporting infantry and the Zippo's own 75mm main gun made such assaults suicidal. The daily consumption of napalm continued at approximately 10,000 gallons as the Zippo tanks worked systematically through the defensive network, each day bringing incremental progress measured more in fortifications destroyed than in ground captured. The crews operating these tanks developed techniques for engaging different types of positions, learning through hard experience how to direct the flame streams for maximum effect and how to coordinate with infantry to ensure that bypassed positions didn't threaten their flanks or rear. Maintenance became a critical concern as the tanks operated continuously under the harsh conditions of volcanic ash that worked its way into every mechanical system, and battle damage from artillery fragments and small arms fire accumulated across their armor. Yet despite the casualties and the grinding nature of the combat, Marine commanders recognized that the flamethrower tanks had become indispensable to offensive operations. Captain Frank C. Caldwell, commanding a company in the 26th Marine Regiment, would later state with absolute conviction that the flame tank, more than any other supporting arm, had won the battle for Iwo Jima. His assessment reflected the experience of every rifle company commander who had watched conventional weapons fail against fortifications that the Zippos could neutralize in minutes, and who had seen his casualty rates decrease when these modified Shermans provided direct support. The question now was whether 8 tanks could sustain the pace of operations required to complete the conquest of the island, and whether Japanese defenders would develop countermeasures that could negate the advantage these weapons provided to American forces advancing through terrain that favored the defense. The success of the flamethrower tanks during the first weeks of fighting on Iwo Jima did not go unnoticed by Japanese commanders, who quickly recognized these modified Shermans as priority targets that threatened their entire defensive concept. Kuribayashi issued orders emphasizing the importance of destroying the Zippo tanks before they could approach defensive positions, and Japanese anti-tank teams received instructions to focus their efforts on these distinctive vehicles that carried their flame projectors on the bow. The adjustment in Japanese tactics forced corresponding changes in how Marine units employed the flamethrower tanks, creating an evolution in combined arms doctrine that would influence American military thinking beyond the immediate battle. The vulnerability of the Zippo tanks during their approach phase became the central tactical problem that needed solving. Unlike conventional Shermans that could engage targets from longer ranges with their main guns, the flamethrower tanks needed to close within 150 yards or less to employ their primary weapon effectively. This requirement meant exposing the vehicles to close-range fire from anti-tank weapons, magnetic mines, and concentrated small arms fire aimed at vision ports and other weak points in the armor. Marine infantry units adapted by providing more robust security for the Zippos during their advance, with rifle squads moving ahead to clear likely ambush positions and machine gun teams providing suppressive fire against suspected defensive positions. The coordination between flamethrower tanks and conventional armor improved as crews learned to work together in mutual support. Standard Shermans would engage bunkers with high explosive rounds and provide covering fire, while the Zippos maneuvered into position, and once the flamethrower had done its work, the conventional tanks would shift their attention to the next target in the sequence. This leapfrog approach allowed continuous pressure on Japanese defenses while minimizing the exposure of any single vehicle to concentrated enemy fire. Artillery support became more precisely timed, with forward observers calling for fire missions that would suppress defensive positions during the critical moments when the Zippos made their approach. The psychological effect of the flamethrower tanks extended beyond their immediate targets to affect the morale of Japanese defenders across the entire northern sector of the island. Soldiers who had not yet encountered the Zippos directly heard accounts from survivors of positions that had been attacked, and the knowledge that these weapons existed and would eventually reach their sector created an atmosphere of dread that eroded the determination Kuribayashi had worked so hard to instill. Some Japanese units attempted what might be termed psychological countermeasures, spreading rumors among their own troops that the flamethrower tanks could be defeated through close assault, or that American forces had only limited quantities of napalm that would soon be exhausted. These efforts achieved mixed results at best, as the daily appearance of the Zippo tanks and the steady reduction of defensive positions provided tangible evidence that contradicted the reassuring rumors. The crews operating the flamethrower tanks developed an understanding of their weapons' capabilities and limitations that could only come through repeated combat employment. They learned that the most effective technique involved sustained bursts rather than quick shots, as the continuous stream of burning napalm could find its way through complex defenses and reach deep into tunnel systems. They discovered that timing their approach to coincide with infantry assaults divided Japanese defensive fire and reduced the attention focused on the tanks themselves. They recognized the importance of varying their routes of advance to prevent defenders from pre-positioning anti-tank weapons along predictable paths. By early March, with the battle entering its second month and American forces having paid a terrible price for every yard of advance, the Zippo tanks remained operational and effective despite the cumulative wear of continuous combat. CB maintenance teams worked around the clock to keep the vehicles running, fabricating replacement parts when standard supply channels couldn't provide them, and performing repairs under conditions that would have seemed impossible in peacetime. The 8 flamethrower tanks had become force multipliers of immense value, their contribution to the battle far exceeding what their small numbers might suggest. Yet the hardest fighting still lay ahead, concentrated in a gorge at the northwestern end of the island, where Kuribayashi had established his final command post, and where the remaining Japanese defenders would make their ultimate stand. The gorge that sheltered Kuribayashi's command post stretched 640 meters through volcanic rock at the northwestern tip of Iwo Jima, its walls rising steeply on both sides and its floor littered with volcanic debris that made movement difficult and exposed any force attempting to advance through its length. The Japanese commander had selected this location with characteristic attention to defensive requirements, understanding that it would become his final position and that American forces would eventually concentrate their efforts on reducing this last pocket of organized resistance. The fortifications incorporated into the gorge exceeded in complexity anything the Marines had previously encountered, with multiple levels of tunnels connecting fighting positions, supply caches, and personnel shelters that could withstand even direct hits from heavy artillery. By mid-March 1945, the island had officially been declared secure, yet this pronouncement held little meaning for the units still engaged in reducing the final Japanese positions. The declaration of security was a military formality driven by schedule requirements and the need to begin utilizing Iwo Jima's airfields for their intended purpose of supporting the eventual invasion of Japan. For the 5th Marine Division facing the Gorge Complex, the reality was that hundreds of Japanese defenders remained entrenched in positions they had prepared for months and showed no inclination towards surrender despite the hopelessness of their tactical situation. The Zippo tanks that had proven so effective during the earlier phases of the battle faced unique challenges in the gorge environment where their mobility was restricted and where the steep walls limited their ability to maneuver away from threats. Marine commanders recognized that reducing the gorge would require a combination of all available weapons and tactics, with the flamethrower tanks playing a crucial but not exclusive role. Engineers prepared demolition charges measured in tons rather than pounds, calculating the amount of explosives necessary to collapse tunnel sections and seal off the interconnected defensive network. Infantry units identified approaches that would allow them to reach the gorge floor and walls, while minimizing their exposure to fire from the numerous cave mouths that dotted the volcanic rock. The assault on the gorge began with conventional artillery fire that saturated the area with high explosive rounds, an attempt to suppress defensive positions and potentially collapse some of the tunnel entrances through sheer volume of fire. The bombardment achieved limited results, as Kuribayashi's engineers had constructed the fortifications to withstand precisely this type of attack, and most of the defenders simply withdrew deeper into the tunnel system until the barrage lifted. When Marine infantry advanced into the gorge following the artillery preparation, they encountered the same determined resistance that had characterized the entire battle, with machine gun fire emerging from multiple positions and mortar rounds falling among the advancing troops. The Zippo tanks moved forward carefully, their commanders aware that the confined space offered limited room for maneuvering and that Japanese anti-tank teams would certainly be positioned to take advantage of this vulnerability. The first flamethrower tank to engage positions in the gorge drew concentrated fire that scarred its armor with bullet strikes and shrapnel impacts, but failed to penetrate the Sherman's protective plating. The bow-mounted flamethrower traversed across the cave mouths that riddled the gorge walls, sending streams of burning napalm into each opening in sequence, the bright orange flames reflecting off the volcanic rock and creating an infernal spectacle that seemed to transform the gorge into a representation of the nightmare landscape that correspondent Sherrod had described weeks earlier. The effect on Japanese defenders trapped in the sealed tunnels was catastrophic, as the napalm consumed the oxygen they needed to survive and created temperatures that made the spaces uninhabitable. Some soldiers emerged from alternate exits only to encounter Marine infantry positioned to interdict such attempts, while others remained in the tunnels and perished from asphyxiation or burns. The systematic reduction of the gorge positions continued for days, with the Zippo tanks engaging each cave system, while engineers prepared the massive demolition charges that would seal the tunnels permanently. On March 21st, Marines detonated 4 tons of explosives against Kuribayashi's command post, collapsing the elaborate fortification and likely ending the life of the Japanese commander, though his body was never recovered or definitively identified. The final Japanese counterattack came on the night of March 25th, when a 300-man force launched a silent assault against American positions near Airfield No. 2. Unlike the traditional banzai charges that had characterized earlier Pacific battles, this attack proceeded without the usual shouting and followed sound tactical principles in its execution. Army pilots, Seabees, and Marines fought the attackers for 90 minutes in close-quarters combat that resulted in heavy casualties on both sides before the Japanese force was annihilated. The next morning, March 26th, the island was again declared secure, and this time the declaration reflected reality, as organized Japanese resistance had finally ceased. The battle for Iwo Jima concluded with casualty figures that shocked even veteran observers of the Pacific War's brutality. Nearly 7,000 Americans dead and many more wounded, while Japanese deaths numbered approximately 18,000 out of the original garrison of 21,000. The 36 days of fighting had consumed resources and lives at a rate that prompted serious questions about the sustainability of the island-hopping campaign if future battles proved equally costly. Yet amid the grim arithmetic of casualties and material expenditure, military analysts focused considerable attention on the role that flamethrower tanks had played in enabling American victory against fortifications that conventional weapons struggled to reduce. The assessment provided by Captain Caldwell That the flame tank, more than any other supporting arm, won the battle found support in after-action reports filed by commanders at every level of the Marine Corps hierarchy. The 8 Zippo tanks that Navy Seabees had modified in Hawaii workshops had engaged hundreds of fortified positions during the month of combat, consuming approximately 10,000 gallons of napalm daily and accounting for a disproportionate number of enemy positions destroyed relative to their small numbers. The psychological impact these weapons exerted on Japanese defenders proved as significant as their physical destructiveness, forcing soldiers who had demonstrated extraordinary courage in the face of conventional weapons to abandon positions or face incineration. The success on Iwo Jima accelerated the production and deployment of flamethrower tanks for subsequent operations in the Pacific Theater. During the Battle for Okinawa, which began in April 1945, American forces employed flamethrower tanks in larger numbers and incorporated lessons learned from the Iwo Jima experience into their tactical doctrine. Army commanders who had previously been skeptical about specialized vehicles came to appreciate the capabilities these weapons provided against fortified positions, and they noted that American troops demonstrated a marked preference for following flamethrower tanks rather than conventional armor due to the fear these weapons inspired in enemy forces. The psychological warfare aspect of the flamethrower tanks received official recognition, with statements from senior officers emphasizing that the presence of these vehicles on the battlefield affected enemy morale even before they engaged specific targets. The technological evolution that began with the CB modifications to the M4A3 Sherman continued throughout the remainder of the war and into the post-war period. Engineers experimented with improved fuel mixtures, more reliable ignition systems, and enhanced armor protection for the vulnerable bow-mounted flame projectors. The experience gained from combat employment informed designs for future flamethrower vehicles, though the advent of nuclear weapons and changing military doctrines would eventually reduce the perceived importance of this particular category of weapon system. Nevertheless, the legacy of the Zippo tanks extended beyond their immediate tactical impact to influence thinking about combined arms operations and the importance of having specialized tools available for specific tactical problems. For the Marines who fought on Iwo Jima, the flamethrower tanks represented a lifeline that reduced the casualties their units would otherwise have suffered while reducing fortifications through direct assault. The infantry portable M2 flamethrowers continue to serve an important role in clearing individual bunkers and caves, but the vehicle-mounted systems could accomplish tasks that would have been impossible for exposed operators carrying backpack units. The protection afforded by the Sherman's armor allowed the flamethrower to be brought to bear repeatedly against multiple targets, whereas infantry operators typically had time for only 1 or 2 engagements before enemy fire forced them to withdraw or resulted in their casualties. The broader implications of the Iwo Jima experience influenced American military planning for the proposed invasion of the Japanese home islands, operations that were ultimately rendered unnecessary by the atomic bombings and Japan's subsequent surrender. Planners studying the casualty rates from Iwo Jima and Okinawa projected horrific losses for any assault on Honshu or Kyushu, and they emphasized the need for massive quantities of specialized equipment, including flamethrower tanks, to reduce the fortifications that Japanese forces would certainly prepare. The knowledge that such weapons existed and could be produced in quantity provided some reassurance to commanders contemplating operations that might otherwise have seemed prohibitively costly. In the decades following World War II, historians and military analysts continued to study the battle for Iwo Jima as a case study in amphibious assault against prepared defenses. The role of the flamethrower tanks featured prominently in these examinations, with researchers noting how a relatively simple modification to an existing vehicle platform had provided capabilities that dramatically enhanced American combat effectiveness. The Seabees who conceived and executed the modifications received recognition for their innovation and practical problem-solving approach, characteristics that typified the Naval Construction Battalion's contributions throughout the Pacific War. The 8 Zippo tanks that came ashore on February 19, 1945, had accomplished a mission that exceeded the expectations even of those who advocated most strongly for their deployment. They had demonstrated that technological innovation could provide solutions to tactical problems that conventional weapons and methods could not adequately address. They had shown that psychological warfare, in the form of weapons that inspired terror in defending forces, could reduce casualties among attacking troops by forcing defenders to abandon positions rather than fight to the death. And they had proven that relatively small numbers of specialized vehicles could serve as force multipliers when employed properly, in coordination with infantry and conventional armor. The legacy of these flame-throwing Shermans extended into subsequent conflicts where similar weapons saw service, though changing military technologies and doctrines gradually made vehicle-mounted flamethrowers obsolete by the late 20th century. Yet for those who witnessed their employment on Iwo Jima, and particularly for the Marines whose lives they saved by reducing fortifications that would otherwise have required direct assault at terrible cost, the Zippo tanks represented one of the most significant tactical innovations of the Pacific War. In the calculus of battle, where success is measured not just in objectives captured, but in lives preserved, these 8 modified tanks earned a place in military history that far exceeds what their modest numbers might suggest. The volcanic island of Iwo Jima today bears little resemblance to the hellscape that Marines encountered in February 1945. Vegetation has reclaimed much of the terrain, softening the harsh contours that once provided killing grounds for Japanese defenders and death traps for American attackers. The airfields that cost so many lives to capture served their intended purpose for only a few months before the war's end. Yet during that brief period, they provided emergency landing sites for damaged B-29 bombers returning from raids on Japan, potentially saving thousands of airmen who would otherwise have been forced to ditch in the Pacific. The tunnels and fortifications that Kuribayashi's engineers carved into the volcanic rock remain, sealed in most cases by the demolition charges that American forces used to eliminate them as threats. Occasional archaeological expeditions explore these subterranean spaces, recovering artifacts and human remains that provide silent testimony to the intensity of the battle fought above and below ground. The island itself returned to Japanese administration in 1968, though it remains largely uninhabited and serves primarily as a site of remembrance where veterans and their descendants gather to honor those who fought and died in what both sides recognized as one of the Pacific War's most savage engagements. The 8 Zippo tanks that proved so crucial to American victory did not survive as museum pieces, their fate typical of the vast quantities of military equipment that were scrapped or disposed of following World War II's conclusion. The technology they represented evolved through subsequent modifications and improvements, but the fundamental concept of using armored vehicles to deliver flamethrower attacks eventually fell out of favor as military doctrines adapted to new threats and new technologies. Yet the tactical principles these weapons demonstrated, particularly the importance of having specialized tools available for specific battlefield problems and the value of psychological warfare in reducing enemy resistance, remain relevant to military thinkers studying contemporary challenges. For the Seabees, whose ingenuity and practical problem-solving produced the flamethrower tank modifications, the Iwo Jima experience represented validation of their approach to engineering challenges. Identify what needs to be accomplished, determine the simplest method that will work reliably under field conditions, and build it with whatever resources are available. This philosophy served the naval construction battalions throughout the Pacific War and continues to influence American military engineering doctrine into the present day. The modest team of 25 Seabees, who worked alongside Army chemical warfare specialists and Marine tankers to create the Zippo tanks, demonstrated that innovation often emerges from collaboration between specialists with different perspectives and experiences. The historical memory of the flamethrower tanks remains alive in the communities of historians, veterans, and military professionals who study World War II's Pacific campaigns. Their story illustrates how technology and tactics interact on the battlefield, how determined defenders can be overcome through the application of appropriate weapons, and how relatively small numbers of specialized systems can achieve effects disproportionate to their size when employed effectively. Captain Caldwell's assessment that the flame tank, more than any other supporting arm, won the battle for Iwo Jima stands as a testament to the impact these 8 modified Shermans achieved during 36 days of brutal combat. In the broader context of World War II's technological evolution, the flamethrower tanks represent one thread among many in the tapestry of innovation that characterized the conflict. They emerged from a specific tactical requirement, provided a solution that saved lives and enhanced combat effectiveness, and then faded from prominence as new challenges demanded new solutions. Yet their legacy persists in the historical record and in the gratitude of those who survived battles that might have been even more costly without the capabilities these weapons provided. The flames that arced across volcanic rock and flowed into fortified positions carried not just destruction for those who opposed American forces, but hope for those who fought under the flag that would eventually be raised atop Mount Suribachi, an iconic image of victory achieved through courage, innovation, and the determined application of every tool available to forces committed to accomplishing an extraordinarily difficult mission.